Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the ICNC Voices from the Field series. Today we have with us a few panelists who will be discussing transforming women through civil resistance and nonviolent action. My name is David Reinbold. I am the coordinator of digital initiatives here at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and I'll be doing some of the technical aspects of today's webinar. With that, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague, Catherine, who will begin. And later on in the webinar, I'll jump back in and let the participants know how they can ask questions of the panelists. One thing I want to point people out to is to follow the ICNC webinars hashtag on Twitter. We will be live tweeting during today's webinar. So if you'd like to participate there, feel free to do that as well. And let's get this over to Catherine.
Okay. So welcome, everyone. We have people from around the world that are chiming in for this webinar. I'm really excited to introduce it because it's the first in our series of Voices from the Field. So we have normally done a little bit more academic focused or practitioner focused webinars. And because we have so much work that's going on in the field, we are going to start combining more academic and activist viewpoints, which is the panel today, but we'll also be doing voices directly from the field as we hear from movements. And the first series of these webinars are focused on marginalized communities and marginalized communities that are actually led by those that are in the field, the most marginalized populations. And so this is our first one, which is transforming women through nonviolent resistance movements. We're going to be looking at both how women transform movements, but also how women are transformed by movements. So I think it's a double piece there, and it's a very interesting field. And we're really excited to have our two panelists here today. Reena Shadaan, who is a doctorate candidate in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University out of Toronto, Canada. Her work explores gender and environmental racism, environmental health, and reproductive justice. Since 2013, she's been a member of the coordinating committee of the North American Solidarity Tier of the International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal, an environmental justice and corporate accountability campaign that is led by those survivors of the 1984 Bhopal gas disaster, seeking justice for the ongoing disaster in Bhopal, India. So we're really excited to have Reena with us here today. Welcome, Reena. And we also have Arnab Chakraborty, who works at a national NGO called Pradhan with and for extremely poor marginalized women to create robust community organizations to stimulate change in each member. The women that he works with work together to create synergy, social capital, a social and political space for them to change the distribution of power in society. All of this works to enable women to take charge of their own lives around the economic and socio-political realm. This is to ensure that each woman is supported to develop livelihood options, enhancing her control over economic resources, effectively participating in local governance systems, and building gender-sensitive accountability processes, as well as negotiating interfamily issues that hinder equal rights for women and girls, including domestic violence and access to rights and entitlements that are enshrined in the Indian Constitution. Arnab is also a 2016 Learning Initiatives Network, or LIN, Fellow at the Institute ICNC, and he is working with this project with women that are Adivasi tribal women out of West Bengal. And I was really excited to be honored to be able to go and observe and participate in one of those first trainings back in November. And I appreciated the invite, and it gave me an amazing insight into the work that Arnab's doing and the amazing women, the Didis, as they call themselves, the sisters that are working together against such great odds and such traditional societies for change. So those are our two esteemed panelists, and we'll get to them very soon. I wanted to go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Catherine Hughes-Freytek, and I am the Director of Global Field Initiatives at ICNC, and it's really my honor and great joy to be able to work with movements, practitioners, activists in the field around the world, really globally, I would say over 100 countries that we're in touch with, to try to find ways to support education, dissemination of information, translations, and actually skill building on how to wage movements, case studies about movements, and how to learn from others and be connected with others to be successful in those nonviolent movements. And so I'm going to get this started with a little bit about women and nonviolent resistance movements. This is a really broad field, and today we're looking at a case study of 2 different movements in India, but we hope that this will be really useful for those working in actually the global south or even Western and global north countries as far as what's working with organizing, what advantages women bring to those movements, and how women-led or women-majority movements are different than other kinds of movements. So I wanted to get us started. I want to give credit to Mary King and Anne-Marie Codur. Those are 2 of my colleagues. They're both academic council members and senior advisors with ICNC, and they've done a lot of work about women and nonviolent resistance movements over the years. So a lot of what I'm going to be highlighting is coming from their work, and I want to give them credit for all the great research they've done. So I'm starting out to kind of frame this discussion with the most obvious argument for women's involvement in movements, and that would be if having large numbers of people mobilized in a movement is key to the success of the campaign or movement, not actively involving half of the population, women, is at best poor strategy and at worst stupidity. I think this is something really important to understand. As I've worked with movements around the world this last year, sessions on women and nonviolent resistance have been one of the most popular parts of our workshops or presentations for both men and women. And I think it's because we're really focusing on some of the practical issues with movements and women involved, and they know this both kind of intuitively, but also from their actual practice with movements, but they haven't always had someone talk about it or explain it or look at it in a more quantitative, qualitative way. And so this is great kind of content for them to be able to share with others in their movement, with people that are more traditional that may not understand the importance of women and women-led movements and women in movements. And so, you know, again, thinking through that, we know that participation is key to movements, so leaving out half the population is not really a good strategy. As far as moving on, we talk about something called the Trifecta, and that is a concept and an article that Hardy Merriman, our president, has written about and published. And there are 3 key indicators of success that he discusses that are key for movements. So when you look at a movement or campaign you're working at, if those 3 parts are there and they're strong, you have a very good likelihood that you're going to be successful in the movement. And I think this ties into the aspect of women in resistance. So the first one is unity with diverse participation and many inclusive groups of society involved. And as we look at women, both qualitative and quantitative studies have shown that they tend to have broad social networks. They have a lot of kin relationships that they keep up with often, and they have, it seems to be, more connections across religious, ethnic, and class divides. And one example would be in Liberia, the women that worked toward peace there, where Muslims and Christians came together across that ethnic and religious divide and worked closely together for peace, where the men didn't seem to be able to do that. And they used nonviolent movements to push toward a peace process and actually implement it. The second part of the trifecta, or the 3 key indicators, is strategic planning capacity and effective and appropriate leadership. That's part of that. And so building women's leadership capacity can build the strategic planning capacity of the movement itself. Studies have shown, fairly recent ones that I can think of in North America, but others, that women are rating the best as managers in corporations and as large organizations. And they also, the new neuroscience has shown through MRI that women actually integrate both sides of their brain. And they don't know exactly why this is, whether this is learned, whether it's inherent, but women tend to have a better integration of a left and right brain, and they think that this leads to the strengths that women have in communication, in compassion, and in kind of networking and interacting with others. And those are key parts of leadership. When you have effective leadership in grassroots movements, it tends to be very horizontal, and women are very well placed to have those conversations, have that communication, be able to strategize and plan well with integration of the more logical and the more kind of emotional side of the brain, but also through their networks. And then the last part of the trifecta is nonviolent discipline. So we have seen, and we can go on to the next slide, that the level of women participation in a movement and nonviolent discipline is a very positive relationship. So when women are in a movement, again, a majority or leaders of a movement, we have seen that the nonviolent discipline tends to hold more than if women aren't in those positions. And women tend, one of the things that we've found is that they tend to be able to hold that nonviolent discipline through their advantage, their connection to their sons, to their husbands, to men in their families that look up to them, whether it's a grandmother, a mother, a sister, a daughter, that call on nonviolent discipline, call on them to remain nonviolent and to stay away from violence, and not to provoke police or security forces, because again, we've seen that that can lead to more repression, more violence, and more cost for the movement, and less participation. People run away and they get afraid, and then that leads to less indicators of success and more likelihood that you'll fail. And the second part of that is that, again, this idea of if an armed wing comes in, and if you have what we call a violent flank, that also tends to lower the participation. People are afraid to be connected, and it also can undermine the credibility and the morality of that nonviolent movement. Okay? So advantages of women-led movements, some additional ones. Women can use their traditional roles or their gendered expectations to create more backfire if attacked or imprisoned during campaigns. Attacking women can undermine credibility of a regime or an opponent and build sympathy for members both of their community and the broader society, but also the opposition. Women tend to be better placed to do that. And in traditional societies, women sometimes are not expected to be the leaders. And so sometimes they can use that to their advantage, where they can go under the radar, they can pass communications more easily, they can travel between regions and maybe spread the word and do training or prepare people. They can recruit new members, and they can even carry out those nonviolent resistance campaigns in ways that men might be more targeted, or people are watching them more closely. And then the whole idea of basically women can keep societies functioning even when many of the men could be arrested, could be having to go underground, are being targeted. So the idea of existence as resistance. And here I think of Palestine, where women have kept the movement going for more than 60 years, where huge amounts of their men counterparts, sons, husbands, fathers, have been arrested, tortured, imprisoned, or killed. And they've kept the whole society moving ahead, keeping the economic systems going, keeping families and societal systems going, and really the whole idea of existence as resistance. Basically, this leads into the changing the dynamics of confrontation. Again, women being able to disarm or use the persuasion factor. Women can sometimes successfully reach out to the humanity of soldiers. They can fraternize with police. Sometimes those are members of their families, their sons, their husbands. And it's easier for them, and kind of more of, again, the role in society, many traditional societies, to be able to bring them candy and flowers and hold on to them or hug them at times. And part of this helps cause defections. So those parts of society that are part of the opponent or holding up some oppressive regime or repressive system, sometimes women are best placed to pull people over to help them disarm or defect to the other side, or just neutralize them. So in the sense of maybe they won't follow orders to shoot to kill or to beat people if the women are up front and are trying to convince them. And we've got the examples of Tahrir Square in Cairo and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. And then history of women in civic action. Basically, the whole, if you think about nonviolent action and nonviolent strategy, women may be the first leaders of this whole field. If you think about their own lives over history, women have always had to face male-led structures of power, patriarchy and other systems. And so they've developed really great strategies and tactics that are nonviolent to deal with these abusive power structures. And usually they don't do that face-to-face confrontation or violently, because again, then that violence is going to backfire against them. So they have other means of tactics. And you can think about, societal issues, economic boycotts where women control the purse strings of a family, even withdrawing sex, which is an interesting tactic that a number of women have used throughout history, and have just worked recently in Kenya where they refused to have intimate relations with their partners until they signed up to vote. So that's an example. And women are seeking ways of struggling in general because they are life bearers, because they are normally taking care of members of society and children. They look for protection of life. They look for constructive types of struggle that normally avoid death or destruction for themselves, their children, their family, and even the community or either Mother Earth. And so that is a strong advantage and connection with women to nonviolent struggles. Okay. Getting toward the end of this initial introduction, the two struggles are really historically connected as far as the broader struggle for rights. So women have been leading and majority members in things like voting rights and rights for equality and against class structures or caste systems. But they've also struggled for their own rights, for reproductive rights, against female genital mutilation, against domestic violence. And historically, one may start and spread to the other. They may be intertwined, and in the case of the Indian models we're going to be looking at, there's kind of one of each of these. One is more focused on women's rights to begin with, but looking at broader societal issues. And in the Bhopal situation, they're looking at justice for the community, and yet, again, building women's rights and empowerment along the way. And I think this quote by one of my favorite women, Zahra Kamal, who is the first Palestinian woman to be elected the head of a political party in Palestine. This was a quote by Mary King, who wrote a book about the Palestinian nonviolent resistance movement and the First Intifada. Zahra said, "Personal and national liberation go hand in hand. When both sexes are deprived of their freedom and national dignity, in this case by the Israelis, it would be inappropriate for us to deal only with sexual inequalities. On the other hand, we will both fail women and our cause for national liberation if we do not understand that liberating women from discrimination will better equip them for waging a successful national struggle." And so I think that speaks to a lot of struggles around the world with women where they are asked to choose to fight for a cause or a national struggle first and really forget about their own rights. But if they don't also fight for their own rights in a parallel way, they may lose those once the struggle is actually the success of the national struggle. So they're very interconnected. So with that, I want to turn to Arnab, and I would like to hear a little bit about now talking about his specific movement that he's involved in West Bengal, and he'll describe it and then kind of talk a little bit about his own role in that movement. Go ahead, Arnab.
Yeah. Our story is in the tribal hinterlands of eastern India, in western parts of West Bengal. It's an undulating and hilly terrain, and the area is excessively prone to degradation, making the ecosystem vulnerable with reducing carrying capacity. And this poses a big challenge for the local people in terms of their sustainable livelihoods and income security, resulting in abject poverty. And this sets a motion of a vicious cycle of low confidence, poor husbandry, and low investment, leading to even lower productivity. The social, political, and psychological scenarios are also not at all encouraging. There is no visionary social leadership to cultivate the value of interdependence, non-violence, empathy for the weaker sections, and upholding the positions of women in the society. The larger society did not recognize the humanity of these resource poor, marginalized, voiceless community, and especially the women, and left them at the receiving end for generations. Now coming to the conditions of the women, uh, it's very worse in terms of the general quality of life in the society and share of decision-making power, income and food even within a poor family. And you'd be surprised to know that women in these families play a central role in agriculture, livestock management and gathering from forests. There are numerous examples when women are pressurized and isolated in their home and denied their access in the public realms of workplace, marketplace, and public decision-making forums. Their external exposure, access to information, resources, and even mobility and voice are severely restricted and limited. They are seldom acknowledged and appreciated as farmers, and they remain as mere conduits of implementing developmental programs. For the last 20 years, I am working with and for these poor women on large-scale promotion of sustainable livelihoods, expecting that in the process of this, it would automatically lead women in the poor communities to become more conscious of and assertive about their rights and entitlements, and the society would thereby become more equitable. But empirical evidence on the ground shows that it is not necessarily the case. The experience indicates that whereas the implementation of livelihood projects, they have led to food security and higher income, these do not necessarily lead to reduction in discrimination and injustice in the society, and more specifically for the communities I work with. Last year, I got a chance to be a part of ICNC's Fletcher Summer School and the Learning Initiative Network. These programs helped me to learn about civil resistance and nonviolent movements. Along with my colleagues, I critically reflected on our work in the light of this learning and understood that the first thing we need to do is to stimulate change in these women who individually feel powerless and who themselves have not experienced a fair world. I started orienting these poor women to reflect on their lives and help them creating a collective consciousness on civil resistance and building knowledge and instilling confidence to trigger nonviolent activism. And within just 3 months, a huge number of women, they are bubbling with confidence, and they have grown confidence on the strength of people power, which is their own collective power to change the discourse of the society. These women have brought many other women under the umbrella and have undertaken various movements on stopping liquor consumption, stopping wife beating, and bringing improvements and transparency in the integrated child development services and public distribution systems. These are all government-run programs. As of now, their movements are growing and they are conveying great stories of change, helping them to assert as equals and rediscover hope in their lives. So let me walk you through a small PPT.
Yes, Arnab, we've actually been rolling through your slides as you've been talking, which is great.
Yeah.
So
now from the first one,
go ahead.
Yeah, the first one, please. The first slide.
Okay, we're heading back.
Yeah, please.
Just go ahead, I think, Arnab. We just got a couple more minutes for the introduction of the movement. And so they've seen most of them already. We're up to the soccer playing one.
Yeah, so you can see there are different pictures of challenging stereotypes. It started with a vision building exercise, and there was rigorous follow-up. These women are mostly illiterate, so the whole module was based on simulation games and use of audiovisual aids. And there were numerous campaigns. And on 8th March, some 4,000 women, they assembled to celebrate Women's Day. And for the very first time, their voices were heard. They could get promises from many government departments to help them. So those are the things I wanted to present through the PPT.
Great. Thank you so much, Arnab. And again, it's just such an amazing example of, and we'll talk about it with some of the questions coming up in our discussion, but the fact that, as you've mentioned many times before, you know, most of these women didn't even go out of their houses for much of their life. And so the work that you've been doing to prepare them, your organization has been working with them to build confidence, and now the nonviolent resistance strategy, and really focused on, you know, figuring out and strategizing for major change and improvement in their lives, and up to 4,000 women in just a few, you know, less than a year. That's really amazing. So, and as I said, we'll get into it a little bit more. So now I want to turn it over to Reena. Reena, I'd like for you to go ahead and talk about a similar but different movement, also in India, also with women majority, women led, and we are getting your presentation up now, and go ahead.
Perfect. So what I'll do is I'll start with a brief overview of the disaster, and then I will move into the campaign for justice. So in 1969, the American-owned Union Carbide Corporation designed a chemical plant to be sited in Bhopal, which is in central India. The purpose of the plant was to formulate and later to manufacture pesticides, and one of the components used in the formulation was called methyl isocyanate, or MIC for short, which is a highly toxic substance. On the night of December 2nd and into the 3rd in 1984, 40 tons of MIC leaked from the plant, killing 7,000 to 10,000 people in the first 3 days. The disaster was caused by the unsafe design of the facility and negligence on the part of Union Carbide. In fact, during the night of the disaster, most of the safety systems were not working. The Bhopal disaster continues to be the world's worst industrial disaster. To date, approximately 25,000 have died due to their exposure, and about 150,000 face chronic health issues. This is in addition to the thousands of tons of toxic waste which remains in and around the site, polluting groundwater. The International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal, or ICJB, formed in 2001 following the Dow Chemical Company's acquisition of Union Carbide. Upon acquiring Union Carbide, Dow inherited all assets and liabilities, including that of the Bhopal disaster. ICJB is led by 4 Bhopali survivors groups and 1 Bhopal-based support group. These groups first emerged in the years following the initial disaster, and notably women make up a significant portion of the leadership and the rank and file. ICJB focuses on the short-term goals of relief and rehabilitation, as well as the long-term goals of justice and accountability. The goals of relief and rehabilitation include the right to proper medical care, medical research on the long-term impacts of exposure in order to improve treatment, economic rehabilitation, so that includes training and employment to compensate for the losses of livelihoods due to the impacts of the disaster, and of course social rehabilitation to provide support so that survivors can live a life of dignity. The long-term goals of justice and accountability include Union Carbide, Dow Chemical, and the responsible Indian officials being held accountable for the disaster. In part, this would mean that Dow must clean up the thousands of tons of toxins that remain in and around the site, and they must pay adequate compensation to the survivors. So to achieve these goals, ICJB uses a number of strategies and tactics, and I will go over just a few and give a few examples so you have a better sense of the movement. So the campaign engages in direct action to put pressure on the Indian government to meet the demands of survivors. So this includes things like hunger strikes and marches, including a yearly commemoration of the anniversary of the disaster. This also includes nonviolent physical intervention. For instance, in 2011, there was an action where survivors blocked trains from entering and leaving the station. There are, there are political non-cooperation actions. So for instance, in 2013, survivors held a No Justice, No Vote campaign, saying that they would withhold their vote unless there was a real commitment to justice amongst the candidates and the parties. And there are also economic boycotts, and there are numerous examples of this on the local level and the national level, but I'll share one key example. One of the biggest victories is that the campaign has prevented Dow from making substantial investments in India. One activist, she shared the following story with me. So she said, there was a plant in Pune that Dow was building. This was going to be their global research and development headquarters. When people of that area found out that Dow was going to come there, they asked the government not to let Dow come in. And when the government didn't listen, they burned down whatever Dow had built. It was almost a 3-year battle between 2008 and 2011. They blocked highways, they got arrested, but they ensured that Dow would never come. So eventually the chief minister had to finally say, yes, Dow will not be allowed to come here. This is just one example. Many of Dow's projects in other parts of India have also been stopped. And these boycott actions involve a range of tactics, from connecting with local communities, trade unions, and other groups, holding meetings with officials, letter writing campaigns, and so on. And finally, the campaign uses legal avenues, so filing right to information requests, as well as legal cases. These are a few examples of the strategies and tactics used by ICJB, but there are many, many others. 32 years after the initial disaster, Union Carbide and Dow Chemical have never been fully prosecuted, nor have the survivors seen justice, and so they continue their fight.
Okay, thank you, Reena. And again, that's an example of a long-running struggle, a huge, issue dealing with major corporations allied with governments, and really marginalized people, including, majority women and led women movement. And thanks for talking about so many of the kind of strategies and tactics, but also the successes that they've had so far using both top-down and bottom-up tactics, which seem to be the most successful if you can try to do both. So now let's go ahead and kind of go to our panel. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of ask some questions that I had when I thought about your movements, and I think will help participants learn more about these. So let's start with you, Arnab. Can you talk about how and why the women that you're working with began to play key roles and began to build the movement in the nonviolent struggle that you're working with?
As I've shared earlier, when I started working with these women, I have found them at the receiving end of all forms of discriminations and justice. And she used to believe this to be her fate and accept injustice and inequality as given. As she herself used to contribute this to strengthen the norms of the society, and it perpetuates to the next generation. Her self-view, which cognitively she has acquired, is a perception about herself and the hostile environment where she believes or used to believe that change cannot happen, and she does not have a control and influence on it. Her low self-efficacy affected her well-being, and thus her contribution to the society also strengthens the inequality. So what we started to do is to unleash an empathetic engagement with these poor women, to trigger a search within, a search to have an identity which is much larger than her cognition. She started understanding her own blind spots and see norms, rituals, community traditional practices as unjust and discriminatory, and realizes that there are other women in the near vicinity who are in the same boat, being at the receiving end of this kind of discriminatory practices. Now, with proper facilitation, She would feel connectedness with these women, comprehend that her fate is dependent on her and also on others, and would want to come together to create a non-violent movement. And this number is increasing very fast. The movement in our area is very new, only 3 months old. We started with building a vision with approximately 40 women leaders who have shared their learning with another 300 women. And they have brought 800 new women under their umbrella and organized a big campaign. I was talking about it, involving 4,000 women on 8th March, creating citizen awareness around corruption, poor management, leakages in the government system, and demanding equal status in the family. So that's it.
Hey, thank you, Arnab. And I did want to thank you all also for those amazing pictures and photos that we were able to show, because it really, I think, brings that alive, thinking about the women that you're working with and kind of, you know, how it looks all massed together and the major participation that is impacting things. Reena, can you talk a little bit about that as well, as far as kind of how the women came to play those roles in the Bhopal movement and the nonviolent struggle there?
Sure. So when I was in Bhopal, I asked many women this question as to why there are so many women who participate in the campaign. One of the reasons is tied to women's gendered expectations. So that is all the issues caused by the disaster, from illnesses to the loss of working ability and the absence of clean water, becomes the problem of women who are expected to compensate for these issues. In fact, one activist named Sheila, she said to me, there are more women in the campaign because they are forced to face most of the problems. If their husband is suffering, then they have to face the problem. And if their children are sick, then they have to face the problem. Women themselves are sick, so even then they have to face the problem. So that is why women are collecting the strength to keep the fight on. Women are surrounded by problems from all sides. So this points to women bearing the burden of responsibility, particularly in the context of an absent state. Another aspect of this is the impact on the disaster on the health of children and future generations. Many women express this as a prime driver for their participation in the movement. And this is relatively common in anti-toxic movements worldwide, where the health of children becomes a motivation for women's involvement. In fact, one of the first protests held after the Bhopal disaster was by pregnant women who demanded to know what they had been exposed to and the impacts on their pregnancy. And this was in a context where many had miscarried following the disaster. So these are the general reasons that, in part, explain women's participation in the Bhopal movement.
Thanks, Reena. And kind of a follow-up to that. So what we're talking about, women transforming movements and the movements and being involved actually transforming women. What changes, Reena, have you seen in the women that you're working with the Bhopal disaster and movement? And how do you believe that this has occurred due to their work and involvement in the movement? So this idea of, again, women being transformed by the movement.
Right. So in the Bhopal campaign, women make up a large part of the top-level leadership, the community-level leadership as well. And with that, they develop a range of skills. The women I spoke with discussed different outcomes of their activism. One activist named Usha, she discussed how her voice was strengthened by her movement participation. She said, I didn't used to go out of the house, but now I've started speaking, and it's all because of the people from our organizations. Thanks to the people I got involved with, I have gotten so much freedom to speak. Some women discussed a newfound sense of fearlessness, particularly when confronting authority. This is in large part because these women often engage in confrontational protest tactics where they clash with different authorities. One activist named Rambai, she said to me, I was not used to going out to buy things from the market. I used to feel that people would say something to me on the way if I went outside. I did not go out to buy vegetables as I was not daring enough. Now we are not scared of anyone and anything. And for some women, this new fearlessness was apparent in the home as well, as they felt more comfortable challenging their partners. So there's definitely a transformative impact in terms of facilitating power too, so the development of new skills, and also power from within, agency and confidence.
Thanks for that picture. Arnab, in your situation, what changes have you seen occurring in the women that you're working with?
Reena has used a beautiful word, fearlessness. I will lend it. So in the biggest change I see in our women is also fearlessness and a mental transformation and a belief that she counts, that she can influence, and that she has a voice. She has started believing and experiencing that co-women working together, they can create a huge social capital. And I can see, I am very much confident, and I can see one small spark kindling another spark. The second one kindles the third. And I'm very much optimistic that it will go on and on and on, creating a fire which would change the society.
Thank you. Yeah, this whole idea of the power within and the becoming fearlessness, the fearlessness, and also bonding with other women and building the confidence. I think that women everywhere can relate to that in all societies, all situations. And so thanks for describing that. Kind of building on that, we talked earlier, and I brought it up in the intro, this idea of there are some traditional roles in society that women play that can actually be an advantage for women in movements, but they also can end up keeping women in those traditional roles and gendered expectations and making it harder for women to kind of come out of those and build other skills and capacities. So in the movements that you're looking at and that you're engaged with, what kinds of traditional roles do you see women playing that are part of the movement? And what kind of non-traditional roles are they moving toward or are they playing? And Arnab, let's start with you.
In our society, or I can say the society where our poor women live, the society expects them to be confined within the four walls of their tiny huts, taking care of the household chores. So there are many women in this area who have never ever stepped out from their tiny villages. Now, since these women were almost invisible in all these years, they are stepping out from their homes in thousands and getting engaged in movements have generated a lot of interest in this area. And the movement is gaining huge amount of sympathy from the society at large, just because they are women.
Okay, thanks. Reena, what would you add to that with your experience in the Bhopal movement?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I think there's an aspect of women's involvement being linked to gendered expectations. And as you said, some scholars have critiqued this and found that it ultimately leads to women being pushed out of movements. This is a difficult issue to navigate because, of course, we want to challenge gendered expectations. However, I think the transformative aspects of movement participation are notable and can lead to the questioning of gender power dynamics. Therefore, there is an element of challenging patriarchy embedded in these movements alongside the calls for social and economic justice.
Okay. Thank you. Interesting insights there. I want to go a little bit more now to personal, and both of you are not part of the marginalized communities that you're working with. You are connected and seen as a leader, and I would say a bridge role within those movements, but not actually part of those movements as far as a marginalized women or marginalized communities. You have different connections to those movements. And so this role can be really important. We call it a connection to external actors for alliances, for input, as far as in nonviolent movements and strategies, but also then Arnab's special challenge, which is being a man involved in in a movement where women are leading it, women are being empowered through it. And so I want to ask you, Reena, first, kind of your role being based in Canada, but being an important part of this coordinating committee and the advocacy, and then kind of going in and out and connecting. How do you see that role? Are there challenges, and what do you see advantages and value added that you bring to that movement?
So I work with the North American Solidarity Tier of the Bhopal campaign, which has been in existence in various forms since the disaster itself. We advocate for the movement's goals as defined by the campaign leaders in Bhopal, so our role is entirely supportive. the aims of the movement are decided on the ground, and we determine how we can amplify those demands in the North American context. So I'll give one notable example of this. In 2004, it was ruled that U.S. corporations could be held responsible in the U.S. for damage done in another country. With this, it became possible to prosecute Union Carbide and Dow Chemical in the U.S., provided that the government of India submitted what's called a no objection certificate to the U.S. court. When the government of India was uncooperative, the campaign mobilized in India, the U.S., and elsewhere. Thousands of faxes, calls, and emails were sent to the government of India. Protests were held at Indian consulates in Chicago, Houston, New York, Washington, D.C., and Toronto, and survivors held a 6-day hunger strike. Within a few days, the government of India agreed to submit the no objection certificate, and they have since adopted the official stance of the campaign, which is that Dow must be held responsible for the cleanup of the site. So this example illustrates our role, which is primarily to amplify survivors' demands, but also to increase awareness of the ongoing disaster.
Thank you for that. And Arnab, I wouldn't say you're an external actor. You're part of the community. You're based in West Bengal. You're there a lot. But again, your role is not a woman and not having grown up in this marginalized community. How do you see your role and the advantages and value added?
You have very rightly put. It was a huge constraint being a man and also never belonging to their culture and their society, because I've been born and brought up in a town. So it took me years. And you know these tribal families, they call the external people as Dikus, and they call themselves Hots. And traditionally they would never meet the Dikus. So I have faced this kind of challenge, and it took me years to earn their confidence. And the value which my colleagues along with me bring is to create that enabling engagement, to restore and enhance their sense of agency, and instilling a belief that they have the capability, that they are worthy, and can be the drivers of change for themselves. You have rightly mentioned, this is what we call enabling them to internalize the concept of power within. We also help them to internalize the concept of power with, to recognize that their destiny is a shared destiny, that they must pull together to survive and work together to thrive. They are trained to build knowledge, awareness, and skills, and become aware about the importance of civil resistance, to challenge status quo and initiate non-violent movements, to build their voice, claim entitlements which are long due to them, and influence decisions and systems, creating conditions to hold government accountable. Just I can share one story. At the end of the vision building exercise, I asked a group of women, look, we are here, so what contribution we are making to your lives? They smiled and said that the very fact that you are with us and you can hear very patiently, you hear and appreciate our stories of miseries, that itself is enough for us. So to be with them, I think that's what we do.
Thank you, Arnab. Thanks for sharing that. And again, having experienced your interaction with them, being there during your workshop and seeing the respect they have for you, but also the way that you take such care in letting them lead and letting them have the voice and just facilitating a lot of this rather than trying to be the leader that they look up to, which might be something they're very used to doing and could happen very easily. And this whole idea, again, reinforcing the power within and the power with, which is what builds the movements and the solidarity. Moving on a little bit to the idea of this trifecta, and that I brought up in the introduction, these 3 indicators of success for movements, which are unity, strategic planning capacity, which includes effective leadership, and nonviolent discipline, and the roles that women may play in this, or the strengths they bring to a movement around those 3 key indicators for success, Can you talk a little bit about the role that we discussed as communicator, compassionate engager, networker in the community that women really tend to excel in many of these communities around the world? And do you see evidence that women in the movement or leading the movement actually build that unity and build that inclusion that's so important to a movement? Arnab, why don't you begin?
Yeah, I strongly believe these women to be excellent connectors. And probably the common thread of being deprived and being discriminated against, and the huge amount of agony and grievance that exists in each of these women helps in establishing the interconnectedness with other women. And as I've shared earlier, seeing these women coming out from their private spheres also give lot of confidence to others. Now even women from better off families, they want to be a part of these movements. And in all the training programs, I have seen lot of appreciation on the concept of this Trifecta of civil resistance, unity, planning and nonviolent discipline, as the women related with their own life experience. And now many of these women are providing exemplary leadership in empathizing with the left out women, trying to bring them under their umbrella. They have requested us to arrange more number of training programs for the other women. And they have already made a short-term and long-term plan for the coming years in fulfilling their vision.
And can you, just one follow-up to that, Arnab, I know that many of the women, when I was there, developed kind of a strategy or a tactic to build inclusion in the movement, which was trying to reach out to some of the male members of society. So this idea that if you leave out 50% of the population of women, it's not a good idea. But if you also leave out 50% of the men, that's also not necessarily a good idea as far as building participation numbers. Could you just tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, in all these years, both the women as well as us, they have never ever bothered to involve the men. So in the training program, together we got immersed and appreciated the concept of mapping the spectrum of values. And we thought as a strategy, we need to convince the oppositions and shift the position of the neutrals and earn their support. So during these first 3 months, the women for the very first time thought of influencing the men to support them. So after the training program, most of the women, they have approached the men and the results are quite encouraging. Now many of the husbands are now trying to convince other men to support the movements. So I can share one story with lot of shyness and pride. One of the women leaders shared that her husband has told her, you have kindled hope in our lives and you have illuminated all of us with your courage and determination. Something she has never heard for years.
Thank you.
Those kind of changes started taking place.
It gives me goosebumps just to be able to really think the community that you're in and the impact that they're having. Reena, as far as the Bhopal movement, which is this long-term movement, very well organized, large, international, can you talk a little bit about the role of the women there with this communicator networking advantage and strength, and how that's impacted building unity and building diverse and inclusive movement in Bhopal?
So community mobilization is really fundamental to all movements, and this is no exception. Much of the community mobilization in this case is done by women who go from community to build support for stronger collective action, as well as report back to the leadership on the issues that those in the impacted communities are facing. So women are crucial in building and sustaining the movement. In turn, this collective power that they build creates unity and fosters a sense of confidence. So for instance, when I was in Bhopal, a number of women shared with me the importance of collectivity. One activist named Shantibai, she said, "All my power comes from other women only. When I see them, I go ahead. I did not feel powerful before, and now my power has come after seeing other women." Another activist named Resham B, she echoed this sentiment and she said, I cannot do anything on my own. Since we are all walking together and doing it all together, that is why we've been able to do it. Secondly, in the context of the Bhopal disaster, one outcome was the facilitation of unity between Muslim and Hindu communities living in the impacted areas, because both were dealing with similar losses to their health, livelihoods, and their loved ones. And this unity continues in the Bhopal campaign. In fact, it's illustrated in the symbol for the International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal, which depicts a Muslim woman and a Hindu woman fighting alongside one another. Finally, two of the women leaders in the campaign, Champa Devi Shukla and Rashida B, they won the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2004. And since that time, they've used part of the money to honor and give a cash prize to other women fighting corporate crime in India. So they conduct a ceremony every year to do this. So there's an important aspect of showing solidarity and supporting women in other movements around the country as well.
Thank you. That's an interesting insight as well. So not just building unity within the movement, but kind of across movements and solidarity with other kinds of movements for justice and peace and stability. So thanks for that. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the third piece of the trifecta, which is the nonviolent discipline that we've talked about earlier as the third indicator for success. So based on your movements, based on your experience, have you seen examples of how women being engaged with this, women as majority or women-led movements, has actually contributed to keeping the movement nonviolent, possibly when they've come up against oppression or violence from the opponent or the other side or threats of violence? And what's been your experience with that? Yeah, let's start with Reena.
Okay. So while I'm not able to draw on specific evidence, I can speculate that the large numbers of women involved in the Bhopal movement are in part encouraged by the use of nonviolent tactics. So referring to Erica Chenoweth's work, Chenoweth found that nonviolent resistance tends to be more appealing for a few reasons. So one, it's public rather than underground, so it's interpreted as safer. Two, it's easier to commit to a campaign when there's not the possibility that you may have to engage in violence. And three, there's a diversity of tactics, including low-risk tactics and those which involve little physical effort. So based on these, Chenoweth argues that nonviolent resistance is more appealing and thus gains a larger following. And that larger following, as you mentioned in the beginning of this panel, is key to movement success. So I speculate that this applies to women's activism in the Bhopal movement, as I'm not sure that so many would participate in the campaign if it used violent tactics. When you look at the movement, you see participants of all ages, from children to the elderly. In fact, one of the leaders of ICJB is a children's group called Children Against Dial Carbide. And Children Against Dial Carbide is essential because they are mobilizing the next generation to continue the struggle. I'm not sure that this group would participate in ICJB if the campaign used violent tactics.
Thanks for that, and maybe that's an area of research that we can look into, or some articles, or as far as with that movement and how it is impacting nonviolent discipline based on what you've brought up and the work of Erica and Maria. Arnab, what do you see in your movements related to the nonviolent discipline issue, and whether women help keep the nonviolent discipline, and what they've learned through their experience or training about nonviolent resistance, and what works and what doesn't?
So when we started our journey, I could witness hopelessness and fear originating from the conflicting collective narratives, historical memories, and a very belligerent social climate. So in many of the training programs, some women would ask that, look, why shouldn't we beat our husband in return? They should also feel the pain. And to deal with that, we presented portions from the landmark book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict by Erica and Maria, who examined 323 violent and nonviolent campaigns from 1900 to 2006. And what attracted these women is the finding that the non-violent campaigns, they attract about 11 times more participants than most armed movements. And for many years, the women themselves have experienced the armed movements of the left extremists who used to see violence as the only viable option to resolve the conflict they were born into, and how easily these movements were curbed. So with this new engagement to adopt the non-violent discipline, the women have started harvesting and enjoying the fruits of non-violent movements and to realize its power. They have understood that non-violent movement can draw huge amounts of sympathy, even from the neutrals and the opponents. And it's a huge power to reckon, which is being appreciated by the society. And I'm sure they will never return to violent actions.
Thanks. So Arnab, that's interesting, the impact both on their own personal lives of learning about nonviolent resistance and what way to resist or change things against someone in power that might be less costly or more effective. So both on the personal and the more collective level. It's an interesting kind of insight. And I just wanted to follow up quickly on that. Have the women that you're working with, when they have this 4,000 person march, or the kinds of things they're pressuring local officials for, the kind of rights and justice and equality, have they received threats? Has it gotten to the point yet where they are dealing with direct repression and violence against them, beating, arrests? Or is that something that they think may be coming up and you're preparing them for and they're preparing themselves for?
Yeah, they are quite accustomed to receive threats. Receiving threats at homes, receiving threats even in their localities. So here also, the individual women, they have started receiving threats from some vested interest groups, some contractors, some people who are not running the ICDS centers well, or even not giving proper amount of food, which is entitled under the PDS system, public distribution system, the ration dealers. But in their march, 4,000 women now, and these women have grown enough confidence. Now, they themselves have gone to meet that individual who has given that threat. So what they did, they assembled some 100 women and marched and went to the house of that person who is giving threat. And he has said, no, I'll never do it. So those kind of changes have started happening. And even the government officers, they have promised huge amount of support. So on the 8th March occasion. So from there also they have gained enough confidence.
Okay, thanks. Reena, I'm going to head back to you. We're getting to the end of the question period from our side, our panel. But I just wanted to ask, what do you see as the main challenges in the Bhopal movement that you're working with currently and even into the future, the next steps? What are they dealing with?
So speaking from, I guess, more of an academic perspective, I think a prime issue is really the invisibility of women's leadership and the invisibility of women's efforts towards movement sustainability. So for instance, when I first visited Bhopal, I learned about a tier of community level women leaders called selected members. None of the literature I had read on Bhopali women's activism discussed this important secondary level of leadership, which really indicates to me the invisibility of women's integral roles in leading and sustaining movements.
Okay. Thank you for that. And I think invisibility is something that I didn't really bring up in the intro, but it's really important part of this. Even Gene Sharp, the grandfather who wrote so much and researched so much about our field, nonviolent resistance movements, tended to give more examples of men-led movements versus women-led, although there are equally probably, you know, women-led movements throughout history and society and tend to be more invisible. So that's a really important aspect. I think that some of the work coming up that Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan are working on out of University in Denver, and some of their colleagues that ICNC is supporting is now looking at this issue, and they're going to be coming out with some interesting studies and articles about women and resistance and some of these aspects of both the invisibility of the movements over time, but women's roles within a movement that are sometimes downplayed or not really recognized. So, so I really appreciate that piece. Arnab, what would you say are the challenges you see in the future, having you know, had 4,000 women come together, marching, organizing? What do you see as the next year, 5 years, and what are the main challenges?
The biggest challenge is abject poverty. Most of these women, they have to work very hard as menial wage laborers to eke out a living. So after the whole day's toil, they're very much tired to give energy to some other thing. So that's the biggest challenge. The second challenge is predominant illiteracy of these poor women. So the training modules and all, they need to be developed in such a manner that it becomes user-friendly. So a lot of simulation games, schemes, audiovisual tools, that would create a deep imprint on these women. And at times, you need to have much more days because of that illiteracy. Their absorption capacity is much less. So those are the biggest challenges, I think.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to end by letting each of you ask each other a question. If you have a burning question for the other person, now that we've worked through this and you're getting to know the other movements as well, there's unique pieces, but there are also a lot of similarities and lessons that I think all of us can learn for grassroots movement around the world from your kind of case studies and focusing on the group that you're working with. So Arnab, what is your question? What would be a question that you would have for Reena and the Bhopal movement?
Reena, how you visualize the women's movement in Bhopal in the coming years?
So Bhopali women have been fighting for more than 30 years now, and I expect them to continue. And a really important part of women's activism that doesn't get talked about is this intergenerational impact. So the impacts that women have on their daughters and other young women in the community. So I expect it to continue. I expect the next generation of women will continue to sustain the movement and lead the movement until they see justice. And Arnab, I have a question for you as well. So I wonder if you can say a little bit on what the women you work with have taught you and how they've influenced you.
I know I'll be repeating while giving the answer, but let me repeat because it talks about my conviction. So the biggest thing which the women has taught me is that their unity can be the building blocks of large-scale social mobilization, leading to a change in the self-belief and identity of an entire community of people. And this would help them to alter the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, which exists in their life. So that's a big learning which I got from the women.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm hoping both of you in the end may find ways to unify and be in solidarity with each other and learn from each other's movements, because I think it'd be even more powerful together. But that will be in the future. That may come to pass after this interaction. Now it's time for questions from participants. We just have about 15 more minutes, a little more than 15. And I want to turn this over for David. I think he has some questions that are coming in.
Yeah, sure. And I just want to remind everybody how they can participate and ask questions. In your GoToWebinar control panel, you will see a little drop-down that says questions. You can type in your question there and we'll prompt the panelists with those. Or if you'd like to, there is a raise hand button. It's the little hand icon in the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you click on that, that will alert us that you have a question, and then we can unmute you so you can ask your question. So it looks like somebody already has raised their hand. Virginie, you're unmuted if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question of the panelists.
And say where you are coming from, Virginie. It's far away.
Hello. Hello.
Hello,
Yes,
Virginie.
we can hear you.
Hello. Okay, Catherine, Anna, Reena, how are you? So proud to be part of this session. Yes, I have the opportunity to greet Anna before the beginning of the webinar. Yes, and I'm discovering what Reena are really doing on the field with this long existing movement. Congrats to the work, great job you are doing. It's very, very, very nice one. And it's encourage other like us working on a field. And my question is about some specific challenges that women can face on the field that can maybe like avoid them to be efficient. That's the case because as women we have specific challenges. So how do you address it? How do you try to emphasize on it and resolve it? Hope that you hear me with my poor English and my way of talking. Thank you.
Virginie, I'd just like to follow up. Could you give us an idea of some of the specific challenges that you have in mind that women face so that they can be specific when they answer you?
Like most of the time you have women that have children. Yes, yes. You have most of the time women have children that they have to take care of. They have to take care of houses, families, and so on. So how can we address such challenges for women to be efficient?
And do you just want to tell us where you're based, because you're a leader in a movement there that is not easy, and I don't know whether you want to mention that, but that might be useful for others as well.
Pardon, Catherine, I did not get you.
Do you want to say where you are coming from, where you're based, because you're involved in a movement there as well?
Okay, I'm from Cameroon, Central Africa country, living in Yaoundé, and I'm ICNC fellow of 2015, and I'm a political leader and also civil society leader. We are now really involved on a platform called Stand Up for Cameroon that launched Friday in Blacks for to push our government to resolve basic problems for political transition, to push government for Anglophone problem, because we have a lot of prisoners, we have journalists in prisons, and so on and so forth. So political transition, good governance, basic needs, and how can I say, refoundation of Cameroon. That's it. Okay, that's what I can say.
So Reena or Arnab, would one of you like to go first?
Sure, I can go first. Thank you so much for your question, and thank you so much for sharing the incredible work that you're doing. Yeah, I think women in movements globally tend to face this triple burden where there's, you know, housework, taking care of children, there's wage work, and then there's this added burden of doing this community work. And I think it's really difficult for a lot of women to navigate. I think a lot of women take on so much labor. I think one solution to it is, of course, addressing the issue of patriarchy in movements, and, you know, making sure that men and others in the family are also taking responsibility for work in the household and whatnot. So yeah, I think that's one sort of way forward.
Arnab?
Yeah, I will not repeat what Reena has already shared, but just to illustrate with examples, which I forgot to mention when Catherine asked about how the women has dealt with the men. In fact, you know, within these 3 months, many of the husbands, they have started sharing the household chores. So that's one positive impact I see. The second is, of course, women have problems, but now it's no more an individual problem. You have other women to help. For example, in the training programs, we didn't, or the women didn't exclude any member just because they have a small child. What they did instead is to depute someone and run a creche, in situ creche in the training program itself. So another woman would come, she's not a trainee, but she would take care of the children. So those kind of supports have already, the other women have started extending to. So I think that's a big support.
And I would just say, Bergeline, just 1 minute or so, do you have any specific input or ideas that you have learned in Cameroon that work to deal with some of those challenges that you'd like to share with the group?
Catherine? Please, did not got you really. Can you, I'm facing internet problems. Please, can you repeat the question?
Yes, I'm surprised you're even on with all the cuts in all the internet in Cameroon. I'm glad you're here. What I asked was just, they had some really good input and ideas, and whether you also, through your experience in Cameroon and intense repression, if you have ideas for meeting those challenges that women face as part of movement.
Opportunity you are given to me to share some
of your own ideas and your own lessons learned. Okay, while you're thinking, Bergeline, we're going to go, and you may have even just, we may have lost you. So I think, David, go ahead. There's another question.
Yeah, Anna, you are unmuted if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question. Anna, are you there?
Yeah.
Anna? Okay.
Can you hear me?
One of the participants was named Anna. It looks like that person's microphone is not working now. Edna, if you would like to go ahead and unmute yourself so you could ask your question. It looks like you are self-muted right now.
Edna, are you there? Okay, Anna's back with her question. Try one more time, maybe.
All right.
Anna, are you there?
Yeah, hi, this is Anna from Armenia. Thanks. I wanted to ask, maybe more relevant to the movement of Bhopal, so maybe just a question for Reena, about how the movement has been able to move through the issue of burnout, and particularly with the women. What consequences burnout may have had so far, what are the lessons learned, and what are the strategies to avoid it or overcome it if it's already happened. I suppose it has happened. And of course, another question was, I mean, this is something that we go back to all the time, but the backlash from the patriarchal system, not necessarily from the husband, which is, again, something that still could be elaborated on further, but what I would suspect, for example, in situations like this, especially in the situation of the women communities in this Bengal regions, would be maybe some cooperation between just, the husbands, fathers, whoever they are in the communities with the male sort of system, which is the governmental system or whoever keeps hold on, the society and the women. So my question again would be, what are the particular backlashes from the patriarchal system and how those both movements respond to them? Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Reena, you want to start?
Sure. I can address the question of burnout. So in the context of Bhopal, and I think in a lot of movements, the important thing to remember is that a lot of people are literally fighting for their lives. So this issue of burnout is not the same as someone that can, someone, for instance, in the solidarity movement that could disconnect for a period of time from the movement, right? Because they're not facing that daily lived experience. So I think that's a really important thing to consider when you're thinking about burnout. I don't know if Arnab wants to talk about backlash.
I don't know, because in our area, we cannot blame the government, because the government sincerely wants their goods and services to reach to this poor community. But there are some power-mongering middlemen who are siphoning the money. So, of course, these are vested interest groups. There can be backlash, as some of them are powerful politicians also. But I strongly believe, and I'm repeating it again and again and again, that this huge people power, it's a large force to reckon. And even if you look at the political angle, so this force not only demands, but also they can give you votes. So the political leader, so they have to listen to them. It's such a strong power. So I believe at present, they haven't experienced any backlash, but even if it occurs, these women, it's a large force, they can deal with it.
Okay. Thanks, Arnab. All right, go ahead, David, some more questions?
Sure. Edna, can you unmute yourself? If you click on the little microphone icon, that's, because right now it looks like you have yourself muted so you can't ask your question.
There we go.
Hello.
Edna,
Good.
yes, hello.
Oh, all right. Thank you. Hello. Yeah.
Hi, Edna.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, this is a very touching topic for me because in Cameroon, I am also from Cameroon like Bergeline, and we happen to be on the same movement working for change in Cameroon. We are called Stand Up for Cameroon. So my question was, I've already sent my question in the form of a written note, and I wanted to know from you how you're making sure that in your trainings, these leadership skills are passed on to the women and that they are not just coming out from their homes into a hall, and after that, they're talking to them about their rights or something else, and then they are going down to the field to take part in the protest and going back home. How can the women actually lead like these planning sessions, and so that we can ensure this continuity? So that was one of the questions I had. Then I wanted to share with you our experience with the question that Jeline asked and she was cut off. There was maybe she had some issues in Yaoundé, Douala. That just to share with you that one of the ways we are trying to because she was talking about helping women, and I wanted to contribute about this lady who was in one of our protests who brought in a young child and they were arrested together. So what we were able to do to help women to be active and make sure that their families are also supporting them but being safe, that we've thought about like getting women like a safe place when these actions, when we are on the field carrying out protests. Like we organize a few women who stay back, we call them the back actors, who stay with some of the children. Unfortunately for us, we come from a community where people are supportive, so we advise them to take them back home with their families or people who can help. then we also encourage women's participation by having activity in their own quarters in the communities so that children can be safe at home and they can be close to their families who can give them some kind of help. So that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thanks, Edna. Arnab, Reena, any thoughts on her question? I think the one specifically about building this practical leadership and ensuring that it continues, whether it's through training, preparation, experience, and how do you keep that going and not just have her be a part of the movement, but build the leadership capacity? Arnab, go ahead.
Yeah. In fact, you know, in the training programs, we take help of a simulation game. So there's a glass of water. So in one glass, there are pebbles. In the other glass, there is sugar. So we ask them to mix. And obviously, the sugar one would form a solution. So we help them to summarize by saying what kind of leadership style you want to adopt. One is you can become such a leader that you represent the people's voice. You mix up with the larger community, like that sugar solution. The other one is the pebble. So one can easily pluck those pebbles out of water. So they smiled and said, of course, we want to be like that sweet solution. So those kind of techniques we use to reinforce the concept of this leadership style. And regarding the action plan, so it's a very detailed action plan they were engaged into. So they have delineated all the minute tasks and then all those W questions. Who would do it, how it would be done, where it would be done, when it would be done, and why these things need to be done. And also they make a plan of monitoring and evaluation very frequently so that the movements become sustainable. So those kind of efforts they take.
Thanks, Arnab.
I don't know whether I can answer you, but...
yeah, no, that's very helpful, and I'll do Reena. We're almost to the end, so Reena, if you could answer fairly quickly, we will take one more very quick question for about a minute, and then we'll be done because that person's had their hand up for a while. So go ahead, Reena.
So in the Bhopal movement, currently women do make up a lot of the top level leadership and as well as the community level leadership. So there's a lot of that. Also, in terms of children, something I didn't mention earlier was that if you noticed in a lot of the photos, women tend to bring their children to protest with them, and this kind of serves in a way to politicize the kids and in a way prepare them to take on the movement in future. So there's a lot of that sort of thing happening in the Bhopal movement.
Okay, thanks. All right, David, we got one more question we're going to take and make it fairly quick, and you've had your hand up for a while, and we're not going to be able to get to everyone, so we apologize.
Yes, but if you do have any follow-up questions that you would like to ask, you can email those questions to webinar@nonviolentconflict.org, and we will try to get those to Reena and Arnab to answer. So James, it looks like you're self-muted. Can you unmute yourself so you can ask your question? James?
Hello?
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to get me?
Go ahead.
Yes, I want to just say about one thing, because there's some movement whereby people have been harassed in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have got most of the people that are involved in those activities is the government that is killing especially women and men in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we see a situation whereby the UN is just quiet, but they know whatever is happening in that country, but they have never said anything up to now. And we have got a source whereby even if some people from UN are involved in the killing because they're stealing minerals from the region where we have got those killings and so on of women. Because most of people that are harassed are women in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Okay, do you have a question, or did you just want to make the comment about what's going on there?
I want to make a comment what is going on, because you are talking about the movement of women for non-violence, but when they go in the streets, they are killed.
Yes.
And there's no one to protect them.
Yes. And I would just respond to that, we know there's a huge issue of sexual violence and threats and attacks also in the DRC that you're dealing with. From our side, and we don't have a lot of time to go into this, but we would recommend that the women in the movement looked at some different kinds of tactics. If women are really being attacked and they're not able to protect themselves, and others aren't able to protect them if they're going into protests and marches, we might start thinking about what we call lower risk engagement in tactics, some more dispersed kinds of actions, which could be work stoppages or economic boycotts or wearing colors or symbolic kinds of resistance that is not so dangerous and does not have such a great cost to women. Because as Reena and myself and Arnab have talked about, you'll actually reduce the number of participants if there's continual violence and it's not dealt with, and people will be afraid and they'll run away from being involved in the movement. So you may need to think about other ways of involvement for women that are being attacked and strongly repressed. So I just want to kind of put that out there, because you're in a very difficult struggle in a very difficult country right now. So I think that we, and again, Reena, Arnab, do you want to make any final comment about his point, or about just to end the webinar? Final words.
I just want to convey my biggest thanks to ICNC and my organization Pradhan to be with me in this journey. And we know it's a long way to go. And whosoever is listening to us, both Reena and myself, we need your well wishes for the movements to succeed and to create a better world. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Arnab.
I just want to say first, thank you to James for sharing in the context of state, corporate, and other sorts of types of repression. It is so difficult to organize, especially when there's direct threats of violence. So I just want to acknowledge that. In terms of the Bhopal movement, I just want to say that the movement for justice in Bhopal is over 32 years old, and survivors continue to fight for justice. I encourage everyone to actively express their solidarity, and if they're able to lend their time and effort to the ongoing struggle that is sustained in large part by women's labor. And also just thank you to Catherine and thank you to Arnab for sharing his important work in the movement in West Bengal.
Thank you. So I would just say thank you first to Reena and Arnab for their amazing insights, your amazing work and dedication over the years, not giving up and hanging in there and being part of really important change, as well as the bridge role that you're playing so importantly. Thank you for being involved in our webinar. Thank you to all the participants and your great insights and your work.